American folklore is a vast treasury of stories and tales which have been passed down through time, often altered in the retelling. Some are based in fact, some were created as fiction and are now accepted as fact, and some are simply tall tales. In some cases, political or personal enemies slandered their contemporaries and their falsehoods are now accepted as history. In others, the public perceptions created beliefs which are largely unchallenged today, despite their being wrong both then and now. Some stories became accepted as true because of locations taking financial advantage of them, along the lines of George Washington's slept here signs on old inns and homes, despite the lack of any supporting evidence. Others lodge in the consciousness through repetition in film and literature. In the video today, 10 tales of American folklore which have come to be misunderstood as historical fact, and how they came to be that way. Number 10. Betsy Ross and the design of the American flag. Betsy Ross was a seamstress in Philadelphia who legends and folklore assigns the credit for the design and creation of the American flag, consisting of a constellation of stars in a blue field and 13 alternating red and white stripes. Those who support the belief, which has been widely debunked, have recently used the premise that there exists no proof that she didn't. They are correct, but there is perhaps less to prove that she did. There is substantial evidence to establish that Betsy sewed flags for the Continental Navy, actually for the Navy of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but the first documented record of her creating what became the Stars and Stripes did not appear until the 1870s, coincidence with America's centennial when it was reported by her grandson. That gentleman, William Canby, presented a paper around the time of the centennial claiming Betsy had created the American flag. His sources were entirely family oral tradition. Betsy was presented as an example of patriotism and ambition to young girls of the Gilded Age as a result of this. However, other than the claims of Canby and the resultant years of the story being repeated ad nauseum, there is no evidence that Betsy Ross created the American flag and no record of her ever presenting it to George Washington. There is a record of a team of Philadelphia flag makers presenting him the Union flag, which contained a Union Jack in the blue fields and which Washington raised above his headquarters in Cambridge, but the same record does not mention Ross by name. Number 9. Ponce de Leon wasn't seeking a fountain of youth. Juan Ponce de Leon is widely believed to have sought in vain for a mythical fountain of youth in Florida, which today has many establishments using that legend to attract tourists. But it is only a legend, one in which Native Americans told the Spaniards that the key to immortality and perpetual youth could be found in Bimini. De Leon first came to the Americas as part of the second expedition of Christopher Columbus, and by the early 1500s he was the governor of Spanish settlements in Puerto Rico, acquiring significant wealth through his royal appointment. Diego Columbus, brother of Christopher, succeeded in deposing him as governor in 1511, and de Leon decided to explore lesser-known areas of the Caribbean. His legal battles with the Columbus brothers and their allies left him with several political enemies, and it was one of these who first linked de Leon with the Fountain of Youth. De Leon made several voyages to the coast of Florida and charted it as far south as the Keys, finally attempting to establish a permanent settlement there in 1521 after the death of his patron, King Ferdinand. Wounded in battle, with natives resenting the Spanish trespass, he traveled to Cuba, where he died. A biography by Gonzalo Fernandez, printed in 1535, was the first to claim that de Leon had been in search of the Fountain of Youth as a cure for impotence. Later biographers picked up the unverified tale, and the legend was born. Nothing contemporaneous with the life of the explorer mentions either the search or the mythical fountain. Number 8. The Pilgrims didn't land at Plymouth Rock. There were many chroniclers of the voyage of the Mayflower and the landing of the Pilgrims both on Cape Cod and later on what became Plymouth Colony and still later Massachusetts. None of them mentioned landing on a rock. Indeed, it would have been exceedingly strange for an accomplished seaman to choose a rocky outcropping as a place to land a wooden boat laden with passengers in rough weather. The New England coast in December is seldom placid, and the Pilgrims had already landed on other sites and were in search of a safer location. Over a century after the landing, Plymouth Rock entered the annals of the colony when a church elder named Thomas Faunce claimed that his father had told him the rock, now known as Plymouth Rock, was where the colonists first stepped ashore. The story took hold in the settlers' collective imaginations. By the time of the Revolution, it was a symbol of freedom, and a misguided attempt to move it to a place of honor near a liberty pole resulted in it being broken in two. The bottom half of the rock remained in the ground, and the top later suffered another accident and was broken in two again. In 1880, what remained of the top was reunited with the bottom using cement, and 1620 was carved into its face. Number 7. George Washington didn't throw a dollar across the Potomac. Many myths exist about George Washington, and a few at least have a passing reflection in truth. Throwing a dollar across the Potomac, however, is not one of them. The Potomac at Mount Vernon is almost 1 mile across. The US did mint silver $2 of differing design in the 1790s, today known as the flowing hair and draped bust dollars. In Washington's day, they were scarce, and Spanish dollars, the famed piece of 8, were still in wide circulation throughout the new nation. Washington didn't throw one of those across the Potomac either. The story of the Cross River toss was born out of another story which featured another river and another item thrown. According to George Washington Parke Custis, Washington's step-grandson, the river was the Rappahannock, located near the Washington family home near Alexandria, and the item was a rock about the size of a silver dollar. But Curtis had only heard the story from family lore. Charles Willson Peale also had a story of Washington's ability to throw an iron bar a prodigious distance, a popular game among young men before the Revolutionary War to test themselves against one another. Washington was also reported to have thrown a rock to the height of Virginia's Natural Bridge. So while he never tossed a dollar across the Potomac, he evidently had a throwing arm of considerable strength. Number 6. John Henry was not a steel-driving man, but a composite of several men. John Henry, according to folklore, was a steel driver drilling holes in rock to fill with explosives, part of the construction of railroads in the Appalachians. His legend is that he raced against a steam-driven machine and won, only to collapse and die of exhaustion at his victory. Several locations in America claim to be the site of the race. The Coosa Mountain Tunnel in Alabama is one such site. The Lewis Tunnel in Virginia is another. Yet another is the Greenbrier Tunnel near Talcott, West Virginia. Other sites which have been suggested as that of the legendary race between man and machine are Oak Mountain in Alabama, in Kentucky, and even Jamaica. John Henry first appeared in song, sung by the men swinging sledgehammers and handling the rods driven into rock. There were several different versions of the song, depending on the area of the country, but they all shared a central truth. The hard physical labor of men with no other job prospects was gradually being eliminated by machines. Many of those workers were former slaves or the sons of former slaves, and they sang their woes as they worked, as they had done on the plantations of the South before the Civil War. John Henry was a legend they created out of other men that they had known, the hardest worker, no longer among them. Number 5. Manhattan was not sold to the Dutch by gullible Native Americans for $24 and change. A long-standing bit of American folklore which has acquired the authority of history is that Dutch settlers, led by crafty Peter Minuit, purchased Manhattan Islands from an Indian tribe for a collection of beads and other trinkets worth about $24. The story at once displays the duplicity of the European settlers and the trusting nature of the Indians, who, from that point on, were doomed to continuous fleecing by the onrushing settlement of the whites. The truth of the matter is that the tribe with whom the Dutch negotiated, the Manhattan, didn't own the lands which they sold in the first place. Enterprising Dutch settlers had already established a fur trading and lumber camp on the tip of the islands and along streams to the north. To protect the fledgling settlements from the depredations of roaming tribes, the Dutch approached the Manhattan, offering to purchase the lands that they already occupied. The Indians didn't live or hunt on the lands and thus had no objection to taking Dutch goods in exchange for what was already a fait accompli. The actual value of the transaction in today's money was several $1,000s, which seems low until it is considered that the Indians sold the Dutch lands for which they had no claim. Basically, the Manhattan carried out the equivalent of selling their neighbor's house and making off with the profits, leaving the Dutch to deal with an unhappy true owner. Number 4. The legend of Mike Fink may have been based on the adventures of several men. Mike Fink was a real person who in life and after his death took on the legends and tall tales told of other riverboat men along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Born in Fort Pitt in 1770, he moved down the Ohio River sometime after the American Revolution and the Indian Wars in the Ohio County ended. Although he is linked in legend to the Ohio River, there is evidence that he actually operated a freighting business along the Great Miami River of Ohio. There, he carried products from the farms of Ohio to Cincinnati and returned upriver carrying needed merchandise from the wharves of the growing city. The river towns and frontier settlements were rough and ready places, and stories of Fink, who was well known for his size and prodigious strength, appeared up and down the Ohio and carried along its many tributaries during his lifetime. Activities of other rivermen and travelers were related in taverns and inns. He undoubtedly related more than a few himself. Over time, the less admirable facets of his nature made him appear as an undesirable character. When Disney featured him in a film with Davy Crockett during the Crockett craze of the 1950s, Fink was rendered little more than a buffoon. His name is still well known along both sides of the Ohio, though few could say who he really was. Number 3. Paul Revere never finished his famous midnight ride to Concord. There were riders from Boston and Charleston on the Massachusetts roads on the night of April the 18th and into the 19th, 1775, alerted by the famous signal from Old North Church of two lanterns warning that the British were coming by sea. The signal was sent to Paul Revere, not to him, before he was carried across the Charles River to mount a horse locally known for its speed. From there, he is known in legend, thanks to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, for alarming every Middlesex village and farm. According to Longfellow, it was 2 by the village clock when Revere arrived in Concord. But in truth, he never made it to Concord at all. The British captured him outside of Lexington, confiscated his horse, and he walked back to the village. The Sons of Liberty had a well-established chain of riders and church bells to spread alarms which had been exercised previously, and when Revere arrived in the towns, such as Somerset and Medford, the local militia companies sent out riders of their own. It was the sound of bells spreading the alarm, as well as some gunshots meant to rouse the militia in Lexington, which encouraged the British patrol that captured Revere to confiscate his mount and return to the relative safety of the approaching British column rather than confront the aroused village on their own. Revere was just one of many riders along the roads that night, several of whom alerted the village of Concord. Number 2. The law west of the Pecos, Judge Roy Bean, was hardly a hanging judge. Judge Roy Bean ran a saloon in Val Verde County near the Rio Grande River in Texas. He gained appointment as the local justice of the peace and hung a sign on his business establishment which read, "Law west of the Pecos." He did have some acquaintance with the law, having been arrested himself for assault, petty theft, public drunkenness, and threatening to kill his wife. After his appointment as a justice of the peace was verified by Texas authorities, he used his new status to run a competitor in the saloon business out of town. He based his judicial decisions on a single law book, once letting a murderer walk free because he could find no law against killing a Chinaman in his reference. Bean became part of the legend of the Old West, known as a hanging judge, in the sense that all who appeared before him as defendants were likely to be found guilty and likely to receive the maximum punishment allowed. In truth, he only ordered 2 convicted men to be hanged. He usually fined miscreants the amount of money they had on their person at the time of their appearance, which he then kept for himself. As a justice of the peace, he conducted weddings announcing, "May God have mercy on your souls," following the vows. He also granted divorces, though he had no legal authority to do so. Number 1. Isabella's jewels didn't fund the voyage of Columbus, Italian lenders did. Christopher Columbus attempted to obtain funding from several different sources, including the kings of France and Portugal, before he approached Isabella and Ferdinand with his project. When he did, they first turned him down. It took nearly 2 years of persuasion and negotiation for Columbus to obtain the support of the Catholic monarchs as they are known today. The long-standing and pervasive myth that Isabella pawned or sold her jewels to fund the voyage is false. The funding came from the royal treasury, which obtained them through loans from numerous sources, including Italian bankers from Genoa and Florence who were doing business in Seville. The main source of the loans was the Bank of St. George, based in Genoa, with branches across Europe. Security for the loans which funded Columbus was speculative, based on the expected riches that he would bring back from his voyage. They were serviced, that is, the interest on them was paid, through an increase in taxes in western Spain. Christopher Columbus's voyages to the New World were paid for in a surprisingly modern way, not by the Queen of Spain pawning her jewelry. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day. Also, why not check out another channel I do called Today I Found Out? I am linking to that below. And as always, thank you for watching.